Hi, my name is Ella.
And I'm Charlotte.
And we're here interviewing Peter and Matthew Kennard, father and son. Our first question would be, to what extent has your relationship between the two of you impacted the work you create and your creative processes?
It's probably better I answer that because I grew up with him as my dad rather than you weren't. You weren't when you were forming your art. I didn't exist, so it's probably easier for me to. But in terms of my dad's influence, as I was saying earlier, it's difficult because obviously art is very different to journalism in the medium and the methodology of the pursuit. But I do think that I got a lot of stuff from my dad, especially the politics. You know, it's funny because my original obsession was art. I used to be very obsessed with art rather than journalism, but I was reading things like George Orwell and stuff when I was young, and my dad had a subscription to the New Statesman magazine, which is a sort of left-wing, well, it used to be left-wing magazine in the UK, and I kind of read it, but without becoming that interested in it. But I think that probably that had put some seeds down for when I finally became politicized properly during the war in Iraq in 2003, or the build-up to the war in Iraq. But like his work is, unlike a lot of art, is explicitly political, and I think that the methodology he uses in photo montage, which is breaking images apart and putting them together to make a new meaning, is quite similar to what I do with my journalism in terms of breaking apart or deconstructing official propaganda and juxtaposing it with facts that are buried or suppressed. So there's that link, and then there's also the creative link, which is the people don't think of journalism as creative, but it is very creative in a couple of ways. One is you have to constantly think up stories, and not just stories. You have to think up stories that are doable. That's one of the major things I learned early on, is that you can have great ideas, but you've got to be able to do them. I guess it's the same with art. You can have great ideas, but you need to be able to do them. And secondly, the process of finding the information you need, because it's all very well to have a good story, but you also need novel ways to get that information often, whether it be through whistleblowers or Freedom of Information Act requests, or there's plenty of other ways of getting information. So yeah, I think it's very linked. I think that I think my dad's, more than any artist I know of, is a journalist of some sort. You know, it's not journalism in what we think is, in that he's not writing reports for newspapers, but he's doing the same thing that journalists do in terms of receiving information in pictorial form rather than text, and trying to sift through it and make it make sense to a reader, whether that would be a viewer in the case of the art. But it's very linked, and in fact, I think that that's what art should be. Art is, as my dad was saying earlier, it's like in art schools, it's and at society at large, it's this idea that you have these genius artists that just sit in their studio like Picasso, and they just get fed this divine intervention of creative intervention. But that's very rare. You get those type of people. I think it's much more interesting for me anyway, as a political person, to see someone who's making creative work based on their experiences in the world, and based on their interaction with the world, and based on their interaction with politics. So yeah, it's very linked. I probably wouldn't be doing what I was doing if it wasn't for him. No, probably not. Although I was never good at art as well. Which is probably lucky, because they say you shouldn't do, if your parent has got moderately famous for doing something. It's useful not to go into what they did, because you're always compared to them. So luckily I was never very good at art. So, but yeah, that's about the long and short of it. Yeah.
Thank you. This is a question for Mr. Kennard Sr., Peter. Do you think that art has a duty to be political, or is this just the direction that you've taken, and using art as an extension of your views and a way to respond to social and political issues?
Yeah. No, I don't think art should do it. I don't think artists should do it or shouldn't do it. It's if they feel passionately about what's going on. It's great that the artists can find a way to do it. But there's no rules in art, because once you start that, you get into, what happened under the Nazis or what happened under Stalin. They dictate what sort of art should be done, which is absolutely horrendous. But it's happening in the States a lot that different sorts of art are being, like Matt was talking about, being silenced. I mean, you don't hear about them, but they're taking shows down that might offend Mr. Trump at the moment. There's no necessity to make art around these issues, but I think especially talking to a lot of young people, they want to find ways to express themselves politically through art in a different way from, say, 10, 15 years ago, because of the world we live in, which is, in a state of emergency now in terms of culture and, international relations, the whole thing. So it's always up to the person how they develop art. But as I said before, I think art is more and more important because it's not corporate. It's people's expression of living in this world that we're in. So, I think that's why more and more people are taking up forms of art and pottery and all these different things, because we're so bombarded with all this crap from the corporations that it's a way of expressing one's humanity.
Thank you. So, Matt.
Yeah.
So your work often exposes the hidden mechanisms of power, from corporate control to government secrecy. What challenges do you face in uncovering and reporting these stories, and how do you navigate them?
Yeah. The first obstacle to revealing mechanisms of control and power that the government or corporations don't want revealed is that there's a high level of secrecy. In the UK, it's actually much better in the United States. There's more of a culture of transparency. It's not perfect, but in the UK, even in Europe, comparatively, it's Whitehall, which is where all the government departments are, is known as one of the most secretive governments in the West. So you have to be creative in how you seek information, and you can get it. So that's one thing. The other obstacle is obviously state repression as well, which is getting worse in the UK and in the West in general. Just recently, there was an American-Palestinian journalist called Ali Abunimah who was arrested here in Switzerland. He was actually hauled off the street by plainclothes police officers. He wasn't even detained at the airport, which is scary, and it's ramping up massively. So there's and that's something to do with what I was talking about earlier, which is that we live in a time when information is much freer than it's ever been, and there's ways to diffuse information in much more in a mass scale that didn't exist before. So the state is having to crack down on that newfound freedom. There's not really much you can do about it. You can either live paranoid and worried about that kind of stuff the whole time, or you can just, but it's very, very debilitating if you do that. And also, you're talking about agencies that operate in secret, so intelligence agencies and stuff. So if you, there's no way you're ever going to know what's going on behind the scenes anyway. And also, the other thing is that if you're a target of them, you can't protect yourself. They're too powerful in terms of their technological. Edward Snowden has done a lot of interviews about this kind of stuff where he says you can protect yourself as a normal person in terms of using encryption. But if you're targeted specifically, if they own your phone, or Pegasus has been downloaded on your phone, you've got no chance. There's nothing you can do. Even a technological whiz would not be able to withstand. So you just got to carry on. And we do have freedoms that not a lot of people have here in Switzerland, but in the UK too. Like in China, I'd be in prison for sure. In Russia, same thing. So I think that in that context, plus the context that we are doing awful things around the world, if you're not using that freedom that other people don't have to expose power, then you're not doing your job right. Because the risks we're at, or we take, are minimal. I have friends that have been raided by police recently and detained at the airport and stuff, but I mean, that's minimal compared to what's happening in, say, Gaza, for example, where over 100 journalists have been killed, and not just killed, targeted and assassinated by Israel for revealing the crimes of. So when you look at the bravery where they're still going out to report in that context, what we're doing is small fry. So there's obstacles, but they're not at the moment acute enough to stop people working. And in fact, my friend Asa Winstanley had his house raided about 3 or 4 months ago. And what was scary about that one was that they didn't even charge him. I didn't know that you could do this in the UK. He had his house raided, all his electronic devices taken, and he wasn't even charged with a crime. Yeah, which is, if you're an American, which is especially shocking, because it's like one of the centerpieces of the Constitution that you can't mess with people's papers or whatever it is. But for me, the scariest thing about freedom and the receding freedom in the West is the media itself, because we had, as I mentioned, 4 or 5 journalists, maybe more, raided or detained at airports from August to December last year, and not one word has ever been written in a UK newspaper about any of them. Not one. In The Guardian, in the Daily Telegraph, in the Times, in all the newspapers. And for me, that's more scary than the arrests and raids themselves, because we don't live in the Soviet Union. There's no government that's going to put you in prison for just writing up a news report that a journalist got raided by the police. So why are people completely dropping the ball? And I think that just goes to show that the public realm in Europe and the UK lies undefended. The NGOs didn't defend them either. The media didn't defend them, didn't even cover it. And I think that again goes to another deeper issue, which is that the public, the civil society in the media has been captured by the system in a way that it wasn't maybe even 20 years ago. They've got their claws into it, and it's being done actually, interestingly, through a lot of institutions that Trump is now defunding. So for example, if you look at the immediate civil society in the UK, I've done some work on this, loads of press freedom groups and freedom of speech groups, ones you would expect to speak out about Asa's case, they're funded by the National Endowment for Democracy, which was set up by Reagan in 1983 as kind of an overt CIA. And obviously they're not saying you can't say this. It's not like that's not how it works. But the fact that funding is so embedded in civil society has had an impact over the years, and has meant that it's completely blunted the power of independent civil society. It doesn't really exist. And I think that the fact that no one's covered these raids of journalists is evidence of that. I'll finish with this. Another amazing example of it was the Julian Assange case, where this guy was in prison in Britain for 5 years, in maximum security prison, for revealing secret US government documents, and not one newspaper ever ran a campaign to free him. Not one. Even The Guardian, who had published a lot of his early leaks. And in fact, The Guardian became the main vehicle through which the information war was fought against him by the US and UK government. And then he came. He was released last summer, and he came recently to Strasbourg to the Council of Europe Parliament, which was because they were doing a vote on whether he had been held as a political prisoner. And the Parliament, which is the highest human rights body in Europe, Civil Council of Europe, they voted that he was a political prisoner in the UK when he was held. Yeah. Now, in a democratic society with a free press, you might think that would be on the front page of every UK newspaper. The highest human rights body in Europe votes that Julian Assange was held as a political prisoner, as a journalist in the UK. Not one word has ever been written about that vote in a UK newspaper, including The Guardian, ever. So it just shows that we're undefended. Our rights are undefended, and the fact is, if they go for the easy targets first, like Julian Assange, but if they know they can get away with it, they move on to people like the pro-Palestinian journalists that have been arrested, and then the rest of us. That's how freedom gets eroded, just bit by bit, and they start with the unpopular ones that they know no one's going to support, but they don't then pack up shop. They go further and further and further. So it's quite a scary situation, but up till now, we still have freedom to publish stuff. So the obstacles exist, but then, you have to. It's your obligation. And also, as my dad said, we are in a state of emergency now. It feels a bit like the 1930s to me. And if you read about what happened in the 1930s, the left, it wasn't inevitable, Hitler's rise to power. There were many mistakes made by the left. And liberals as well. So if we're living in that kind of period, with people like Donald Trump in the White House, like if you're not acting now politically, even if there is and it's minimal here in the UK, without risk, you're really shirking your historical responsibility, because what happens now is going to really define the next generations, I think.
Yeah, sorry.
You mentioned censorship and speaking out about issues. With the rise of far-right policies and leaders, also as you mentioned, censorship and intolerance, what can students or civilians who feel powerless or feel like they have no influence do to make a difference and have their voices heard? What does it take to stand up and challenge these power structures?
And be answered by either of you.
Yeah, either of you can answer.
Well, it's good to say. I mean, one of the things that's happening is local groups are coming together much more. I've noticed, so it's that thing of think globally, act locally, which we used to go on about. It's through necessity as well. Is that people are more fragmented and isolated, maybe because of it. Even though we've got the internet, people don't actually get together. So I think young people now are consciously organising more together and finding ways to respond. There isn't one way or another way, but it's something that even the fact that so many social centres for young people have been shut down, like youth clubs and all that. So it's up to young people to find ways to relate to each other, and then maybe join the demonstrations that are going on, or have sort of discussion groups. I mean, there's different ways to operate. It's not, and as Matt says, we can operate in this country without getting, locked up or, get murdered. I mean, in some countries, like artists have been murdered for doing stuff, especially in the street. So it is the privilege we've got here, and using that privilege to actually make a statement in some way, because it is a privileged position we're in, like Matt was saying, we can compare with a lot of countries. So, yeah.
I mean, the other thing I would say to young people is censorship. There's overt censorship and there's implicit censorship. And overt censorship we all know about, when when things get banned or taken down or whatever it is. But I'd say the much more powerful form of censorship is the silent one, or the implicit one. Like,
what did Chomsky talk about?
Yeah, but that's the 5 filters.
The filters, yeah.
Yeah, of what information gets in. But like I think that the way to, as a young person, is you just got to be, number one, brave, but you've also got to be principled, because you're going to go into a world where every incentive is going to push you towards becoming part of the system. That's the way it works, because that's how you get a good career. That's how you get status. That's how you get money. Like that's what it pushes you into. And I felt it at the Financial Times. There was a lot of pressure to become part of the system, and even when I left, people were saying, "Well, you're crazy. Why would you leave the best newspaper in the world?" But it was a great thing. I don't regret it for a second, because the way that the censorship works is that you then become marginalized. I mean, my dad's a good example of that. Like, although he's known, he would be much better known if he'd actually stopped making art that really criticized the system. If I'd carried on at the Financial Times, I probably would have been a editor of, I don't know, running the bureau in Washington or something, which I would have hated. But so I think that you only live once. We're all going to die. That's the only certainty of life. Sorry to be bleak, but you might as well use it to actually do something that you believe in. And people don't. The way it works is people don't change because they're consciously thinking, I'm going to become part of the system. It's a very insidious system of how you get acclimatized into it. And what I'd say is you just have to be aware of how the system gets you when you're coming up and resist it actively. You've got to consciously resist it because it will get you otherwise. And again, we're privileged in that extent as well, because in many places, if you don't become part of the system, you literally can't get a job. Whereas there are opportunities in the West, in the fringes still. There are some oligarchs who are lefties that will fund like independent media or whatever. It's not an optimal model for how to fund but there are options. It's not like you're going to be destitute out on the streets. So you might not be super rich and you might not be super well known, but yeah, I mean, for me, it was never difficult with journalism because I never got into it for a sort of more traditional, like status or money or career. So it was when I realized I couldn't do the work I wanted to do at the Financial Times, it was not a difficult decision to be like, I'm not going to be here. But I did see people around me changing within the institution because I started as a trainee and I started with 4 other trainees and I saw how it works. So I just say to young people, there's censorship that's overt, but fight the censorship and fight the regressive culture of the system actively. Know that it exists, actively know that they're going to try and get you. Know that the institutions that you enter prepare you for that world as well, because schools like this, but also I went to Columbia Journalism School in New York, and I felt it much more than I did at Leeds, which was my undergrad uni, which is not an elite uni at all. It was much freer. You could have a much more wide-ranging debate than you could have at Columbia. And I could see that actually the reason for that is that Columbia is a preparatory institution for the next generation of corporate journalists. So of course they're going to need them to be educated in the right ideas to get into the corporate media. It's there's a lot to resist, but there's a lot of exciting stuff happening now in alternative media everywhere, especially in England. And England's one of the most boring, rainy, rubbish places in the world, and I never was interested in it at all previously, but funnily enough, in terms of independent media, it's one of the most interesting places. I don't know the situation in Switzerland, but I'm sure it's the same here, because young people have the tools now to just create their own stuff. So I think it is, if we can build that ecosystem, it's vital to changing the world.
Thank you. So, Peter, your collaboration with other artists and activists is a key part of your career, what you do. What have been the most challenging and rewarding aspects of working collectively on political-driven art?
On political?
Driven art, on on the art that you do.
Oh, right.
Collaboratively with people.
Well, I suppose nearly everything I do is collaborative in the sense it goes out to organisations, and it was in a lot of publications, sort of, because there were a lot of left field publications that are now online, a lot of them, or have gone, and trade union places. So I don't have a most rewarding and least rewarding. It's very much about what happens when I'm making the work and it goes out, and if it goes out and gets seen, gets used, then that's a good thing. If it doesn't, then I just go on and make something else. I mean, you can't legislate with art what's going to work or what's not going to work. One can do one. Like, I've done a lot of stuff about Gaza, but probably the only one that'll last was the one with the flag, which was done a couple of years ago, really. But that was just happened together one afternoon. So you can't legislate for that. It's something that happens through working with materials. You know.
This is the last question, and this is for both of you. How do you see the role of art, photo montage, even investigative journalism? How do you see its role changing and influencing public perspective with the rise of AI, AI-generated images, deepfakes?
Yeah, well, I mean, images, as we know now, can be completely constructed and either animated, as film or as stills. But I haven't yet seen a radical image. I don't know if they can train AI to be, on the left. I mean, I haven't seen anything that actually has a critique in it. So I'm not frightened of it. But I mean, the problem is, of course, it takes in everybody's work. There's a whole campaigns now by artists and, of course, writers as well, because they're getting AI to write novels now. And I haven't read any, so I don't know what they're like. I mean, it is scary, I think, and also the copyright of, people's work goes out the window at the moment. There's no legislation for it. So artists are fighting for that, but they haven't got anywhere yet, I don't think. So, but I think, to me, doing montage and, I'm very lucky because I do montage in what I do. And then when I drop dead, Matt still, I've got the feeling that Matt is still going on doing it through words, the same thing. And that's great feeling for me, So, fuck AI.
It's okay, we can
beep it out.
Beep F AI. It's just it's people's consciousness that we've got to engage, and I think that's what Matt's doing is writing. I'm trying to do that with images.
Well, I think with any new technology, there's always opportunities and restrictions. We can use progressive forces can use AI as well for propaganda or for whatever they want, but also it can be used by other actors to do negative things. It's like the internet itself. It holds lots of potential for expanding freedom of expression and allowing information to get out that wasn't previously allowed to get out. But it's also got drawbacks in that it enfranchises people like Tommy Robinson, who I mentioned earlier, the far right. So I just feel like it's not a negative or positive thing in that sense. And in terms of journalism, to be honest with you, I think that you could replace most mainstream journalism with an AI bot. To be honest with you, I think it'll probably be better than the journalists that exist anyway. Like the CNN ones or the BBC ones, literally you could just run an AI program that you could code to take the information from the politicians. They don't really ever contrast it with the facts. In fact, they barely ever do. So I'm not super worried about it getting rid of mainstream journalism. I think that'll probably be a good thing. In terms of investigative journalism, that's a different thing. I don't think that AI could do proper investigative journalism. Or maybe it could, but as my dad said, you'd have to code it to actually want to expose the system, but you could probably do that. So I mean, it is the level of it is quite shocking in terms of the sophistication of the AI programs that I've used. I haven't used it to do super technical stuff, but in terms of just getting up information or writing reports or stuff like that, I'm quite stunned by how good it is getting. So I'm not. It's not something I even think about that much as well, because the other thing is it's a very Western-centric idea. They're not talking about this so much in places where, like Africa or Latin America, so much, or like where the left is a lot more grounded in working-class communities. I feel like there is no left in the UK, really. I don't know about Europe so much. I mean, Europe there's a bit more, but we don't really have a left. So everyone's obsessed with culture wars and obsessed with new technology. Whereas I spend quite a lot of time in Latin America, it's much more grounded in bread and butter issues. And I think that the change in the world is going to come from those places rather than here. I'm quite pessimistic about the potential for change. In fact, I think the right is ascendant across Europe. Well, we're seeing that, aren't we? Although you have people like Mélenchon in France and De Link in Germany just did all right, but in the UK is non-existent. So I think that is kind of irrelevant to the bigger question of what we need to do to change society and how we fight fascism, which is, I think, probably the proximate problem for anyone who's not a fascist now in Europe. So yeah.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure. It was a great
Yeah,
to
it
meet
was
you.
a pleasure.
Thank you.
Great questions.